Hello and welcome to this episode of Read Play Game, where we look at tabletop role-playing games from every side of the table. Today we are thrilled to be joined by a special guest, Martin Nerurkar from Sharkbomb Studios, who is a game designer and the creator of Goblin Errands, the game we just played. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Before we jump into our questions, we would just love to talk about how much we really, really loved this game. We finished playing it, like a week or two ago? Yeah, and honestly, I don't know about everyone else, it was probably my favorite game we've played so far on our podcast.
I'm very happy to hear it. I'd love to hear what your favorite moments were in it.
Oh, for sure.
Well, part of what was really special about playing this game with this group of people is, you have talked about your love for just goblins as, characters and as beings. And we, before playing this game years ago, the game that got us together as a group was a Goblin RPG. So we revisited those characters within the lens of this game, and that was so special to see how they played into it. And I think my personal favorite was we did hit on the classic. There were 4 of us, and at one point we had to sneak into a tall person place, and we were 4 goblins in a trench coat. And it was yes, we hit the 4 goblins in a trench coat.
I wonder how common that is in games of this.
I think it's mentioned somewhere in the text, specifically the fact of stacking goblins on top of each other is, I think it happens frequently enough that it's addressed. It's not there's no special rule for it, but it's mentioned
That's
as a
right.
thing.
I remember seeing in the rule book that there's a page
Yeah,
with
it's
that
somewhere
art, I think.
where the roles on how to do yeah, somewhere on there where helping
Helping.
actions and how do you coordinate actions, and it comes up every time.
It kind of has to at some point. Are you familiar with the game? I don't know how widespread this game was, but the game Weave?
No, actually not.
That was the game we started with. It was kind of I don't think it has support anymore, but it was a tarot card based game where you pulled the GM would pull tarot cards, and that would determine the plot events and characters and locations that would show up. So honestly, very similar to the tables you have in here, but just with tarot cards. And it had pre-generated settings that you could use, and one of them was goblin specific. So that was what we started with. So it was really nice to. I was in our local game store, and I walked by this, and I was like, "Whoa, that's just like the game we played. That looks incredible."
Yeah, I'm very, very grateful for the cover art, how it turned out. It's just so lovely. It's just so the right mix of chaotic energy and friendliness, and
absolutely.
Yeah. It was a process to get there, but it turned out so nice. And I think it's part of the game being successful. I think it looks fun. It's a nice little book. It's not expensive. It has a charming cover. You walk by it and you're like, oh, this looks interesting, right?
100%. Yeah. No, I saw this and I was like, this literally looks like it could be a moment from one of our games.
Yeah. And a game, even if you hadn't have played it, a game that I would like to play. Like you said, sure. It matches the tone so well.
Yeah.
And goblins are just so universally cute. Anyway, sorry.
We just love goblins. If you don't mind, could you give us just a brief introduction into what drew you into game design and how you got into it and where you got your start?
This is always a super tough question for me because there's people who I played Zelda and I was so motivated and I really wanted to start making games. But for me, making games has just always been there. I have a box of board games that I made as a 6-year-old. They're all terrible. They all just roll and move on a board and draw a card and do what the card says. They're versions of Monopoly or games like that. But I was always fascinated and interested in games and just had a lot of fun. Before I knew what game design was, before I knew how complicated making games is, I just made games. I just had fun doing that. So that, for some reason, that was the thing that was just always there for me.
I love that. And then with this game specifically, we've already touched upon it, but it was part of the rulebook that we loved so much. Can you talk about your deep love of goblins and when that inspired this game specifically?
Yeah, I think to love goblins, you need to know that goblins exist. And I think I think it's mentioned in the book as well. One of the first sort of collisions with goblins where like, oh, I love this, I like this, I want this, was when I was mid 90s. I was playing Magic the Gathering. It was still a very young game. It was like fourth edition, right? German cards with white border, and I was drawn to the color red and the kind of things it did. And in the color red, there's a tribe of creatures, and they're called goblins, and they're like little people with like abilities, and they're not very good, but they're funny. And something of that about that sort of spoke to me. I think a big part of what makes goblins interesting and fun to me is I've I'm a very short person. Well, not extremely short, but still, in generally, I end up on the lower end of the tallness spectrum if I'm in a room, and I think that's part of what makes the idea of like small people, I don't know, interesting to me. It's hard to say, right? I opened these cards as like a young a kid, a teenager, more a kid than a teenager, and I liked it. I liked it, and it sort of grew from there. I've always felt connected to goblins as an idea, right? That for some people, I think goblins are like this nasty, evil, bad thing, but I don't think I've ever looked at them through that lens, right? They've always been sort of maybe weird, maybe crazy, but always I don't know. I was always relating to them, I guess. Right?
Kind of a driven by silliness.
Yeah.
Which
Yeah, I
is
mean,
really
there's
nice.
a lot of portrayals of goblins, right? There's like the classic D&D goblin, which is much more an evil, critter that attacks you and steals your children, or right? There's like a lot of weird shit. Sorry, can I curse?
Yeah,
Please,
you can
as much as you want.
Right, there's a lot of weird shit that just entangled in that, and there's a lot of the whole anti-Semitism stereotype, which gets lumped in there as well, which is certainly true of some portrayals of goblins, which I don't think is intrinsically linked to the concept of goblins. So there's a lot of ways you can look at goblins, but it was never for me. It was never like, ooh, I hate these guys and I want to kill them.
Well, I guess if the answer is not the Magic the Gathering ones, I'm curious. What is your favorite portrayal of goblins in a piece of media?
Whew. That's hard to say. I don't know. I would just say I'm just gonna say Goblin Errands because I
Yeah, I was
really
is
like
it
the
this
way
game?
That counts. Yeah.
it is weird because I'm like giving myself a compliment, but I sometimes I reread parts of the text because I want to look something up or something, and I'm always so glad about so many parts of the text that are just so loving towards the goblins and like the goblins and the way they exist in their sense of community and how they come together and all of this because it's written very much from my heart. When I read it, it always touches me, right? So I'm very happy with how the game portrays goblins because it's my way of looking at them, right? So it's the one that resonates with me.
And speaking about words that come straight from the heart, we heard that the initial idea for this game came from a tweet that
Yeah,
you wrote. Can you touch on that part of the origin story?
yeah. So
As
I
so
was
many great ideas do.
yeah. So my weird way into making role I actually by trade I'm a video game developer.
Right.
I just make role playing games as a side gig, I guess. And then just happened during COVID, and there's a whole story on why and where, and there's like burnout and la la la, which might just break our time limit here. But when I was starting to sort of seriously work on role playing games and release them, I was sort of immersed in like the indie role playing game scene, and I found out about a game that somebody made who I followed on Twitter, and it's called Under Hill by Water, I think. And it's a game about halflings. It's a role playing game where you don't go on big adventures. You just help catch the neighbor's escaped goat, or try and get the biggest turnip for the harvest festival, right? And that sounded so fun to me because it was such an interesting look at like role playing games without the big, sweeping, dramatic, world saving conflicts. And I love that. And the tweet I made as just a funny shit post or like a banter back and forth was, oh, now I want to make a goblin game where you play pranks. I was partly inspired by the Untitled Goose Game as well, right? Which came out
Yeah.
around the time of like, okay, let's just be little not that sort of because halflings and goblins sit in like a similar niche to some degree, but halflings are much more the cozy side of things, and goblins are much more the scrappy side of things, right?
Right.
And so I was looking at it from that angle. And so that was the random shit post, and then I ended up making, and then I ended up making the game, which was a wonderful experience. It came together. So I looked it up before because we sent me the questions. I wanted to get some dates straight. So the first ideas for the game I had in May 2021, when I was like sketching out some ideas, and I think the base of what it should be came together really quickly. And then I wrote the majority of the text in November that year because there was National Game Design Month, which is a sort of analog to National Novel Writing Month, or NaNoWriMo, where the goal is to make a little game in a month. And I just had this idea that had been sitting in my head for half a year at that point. I was like, yeah, well, I'll just sit down and make it. And it just came together pretty quick and pretty, like the first shot I had after that month is very close to what it ended up being in the end, right? Sometimes you hit something and you're like, oh, there's something interesting here, but it's still a lot of work to get to where you want to be. And this just hit the mark really, really well.
Well, I'm curious in that development process, because you cited that game, Underhill by Water, you cited that as sort of a possible inspiration. I'm curious, like, what direct inspirations you might have taken, if any, from other mechanic systems? Like, what were your biggest inspirations for specifically the way you arrange stats and rolls and such?
I don't think there's any clear mechanical inspiration. I knew I wanted a very simple system. So I knew I wanted no weird polyhedrons and too many numbers. So I knew it was going to be D6. I wanted a dice pool system because dice pools are nice because you can share dice and add dice. And I knew the game had to have a sort of collaborative angle because it was about small people banding together and trying to solve bigger problems. Right? So that was kind of where I knew, okay, it's going to be a D6 dice pool. And then there's not a lot of stuff you can do, right? You can get very complicated, but I didn't want to. So, okay, of course, it's going to be some dice pool success thing. And then I had the idea of the stumble as the complication thing, which is one of the few mechanics that sort of evolved a little, just very little. So in the game, you roll a number of d6 based on your stat, and 5s and 6 are successes, and you count successes to determine how well your effort is. And every 4 is called a stumble. And in the first version of the game, the stumble is a success, but also always a complication, right? In the final game, a 4 is a stumble that you can upgrade to a success by adding a complication. They're very, very similar, but there's a big difference because in the first version, it's always a complication. That means the GM, or the tall person, as it's called in the game, always has to come up with a complication and put it on the player, right? And this way, it's possibly a success if you as the player have a cool idea for a complication that you want, right? And suddenly the dynamic of where the complication comes from and the responsibility to come up with a complication is shifted. And the tall person doesn't have to think about complications in every situation for every player, in every case. It's sort of distributed better. And that was a sort of one of the, it's a very little tweak, right? But it has such a big difference to how it feels to getting the complication, right? It's cool to come up with a fun complication that gives you that extra success you want.
Absolutely.
We had a lot of fun with the stumbles, and like we had a ton of fun presenting those complications. I'm sure with us, I can't remember a specific instance of this, but it was like, okay, I wanna upgrade this stumble. I want to throw in a complication, and then it would often come from the player who was doing it, but it would also come from all around the table, like, oh, like this.
What if
could
this
be
happened?
funny here? This could. And
yeah, I mean that's part of it, right?
Yeah.
As soon as it's no longer the tall person's responsibility, it becomes one of the players' responsibilities, and the players like to help each other, right?
Yeah.
They also like to help the DM, but sometimes it's a little less easy for them to assume that role. So, oh, I'm going to take over your job, right? I'm stepping on your toes by doing that. So that's part of it, I think, as well, that it opens up to the table much more. Yeah, that's one of the sort of tweaks. And in terms of inspiration, I think a big one is not mechanically, but in the structure is Apocalypse World, because the playbooks as an idea are just so strong and so well executed, and they're really good at, like, the idea of playbooks is really good at, okay, you get this thing, you check a few boxes, you read a few things, you underline a thing, you write a thing, you're done. Your character is done in 20 minutes or 10 if you're quick, right? And for a game that I wanted to be really easy to pick up and play, that was the tech I needed, right?
And a lot of the layout of the ability descriptions did remind me a lot of I've played Monster of the Week specifically in the powered by the apocalypse genre, but it did remind me a lot of that. But what I'll also say is that as the tall person, I would say as the tall person of our group, the stumble mechanic was incredible. It was probably one of my favorite mechanics in the game. It was not only easing things up a little bit, but it made the narrative just so much more interesting. There were so many moments where or when they didn't do it, when they were like, okay, I don't need to succeed that badly. And then I was like, okay, well, here's what it'll look like if you don't use your stumble. I will get to put a consequence there. And there were directions that I saw I never would have seen it taking if the players hadn't thrown that out there. We had one moment that was it was a sack race, like you would see at
jumping.
Yeah, and this was a sack race with the goblins as the person in the trench coat. So they were 4 goblins in a sack pretending to hop together as one person. So extremely complicated, like a big group role that was very hard. Yeah. And there were a couple. What I liked is the way that for the group actions, they could hand over their stumbles to other people, and then the stumbles ended up becoming it made the sack race so much more complicated and longer. You'd think it's just, people going forward, but then I'm and then you bump into this person and they're like, oh, and what if they feel this? And it's just it sort of cascades and the narrative becomes something so much more fun.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the sort of group role is one of the things I like the most about the game mechanically. This idea of, okay, we all, often you have in role-playing games, the situation where we all have to do stealth rolls and 2 of us are terrible and 2 of us fail and we all feel bad about it, right? Now we got to fight with the guards because we didn't sneak into. And I didn't want that feeling that the group feels dragged down by anyone, right? And the idea of, okay, I'm really good, so me being better at it means I can give you successes, right? I can just help you get over that hump. And that feels really good for the people that get helped, the people that get to help, and sometimes you get to shove a stumble on somebody else and they have to come up with a complication to succeed. Right? It's also fun, right? There's a little bit of the scrappiness in there that I really enjoy.
And it really did lend itself perfectly to that goblin in a trench coat thing, because literally each person was specializing more in different parts of the body. So it they chose this most strategic way to arrange themselves in the trench coat, and one person was rolling hands while one person was rolling legs, and
literally we had a lookout, someone who was doing the talking for mouth. It was nice.
I think one of my favorite moments in the game was, I think someone failed really badly and got some complication where it was they had to use the eyes skill, but they just couldn't see because they were in the trench coat. Or it was the sack was covering the trench coat, so they couldn't peek out of it. So just lots of silly moments that.
Yeah, the complications are a lot of the fun of Goblin Errands is everything going off the rails a bit, right? And I think the complications from the stumble are just a key element to that. Just adding weird new elements. Oh, this is happening. Oh, I guess this is now making everything weirder.
Yeah, absolutely. And sort of talking about that specific arrangement of stats, I'm curious about the mindset you had when developing those stats, the hands, legs, eyes, mouth, frame, and heart. What sort of led you to that specifically?
I mean, that's a really good question. I don't really have an answer to. It was just there very early on, or at least a version of it. That's another one of the things that changed between the first version and the final version. I don't remember where it came from. I just had it and I liked it. It felt good to have goblins have grabby hands and mouth as a stat, because you want to spit or eat something or chew on something. Made sense as a stat, and then just talking becomes part of it. So that sort of made a lot of sense. The first version was hands, legs, eyes, mouth, frame, and muscles, where frame was endurance, as a sort of, because I knew I never wanted death as an element in this game. It's just not, goblins don't die. It just doesn't happen. This is not a game that's about survival in that sense, right? So I had frame as the sort of infinite stat, and then I had muscles as a sort of 0 stat. That's always, you never can do anything with raw power. And I shifted them to heart and frame, because I think frame is a better word than muscles for your general stature, right? It's not just about muscles, it's also about size. And heart is felt it happened somewhere in playtesting. It just feels so. I'm getting little goosebumps because it feels so perfect for what the game wants to be. Because these are loving goblins, right? They're full of heart. They have infinite heart. They have infinite energy. You just cannot get them. Kind of bring them down, right?
Yeah, I've never seen something like that in a game before, where like stats are so they're locked into that infinity or zero set, and I think that like initially when you see that you're like, well then what's the point of the stat? But then you realize how much that frames the tone of the game so perfectly, and you can use the stats still.
Yeah, I think the first version actually didn't have these stats, or some they were like a step before the or somewhere in the way to the first version, right? Before the first things I had were hands, eyes, the things goblins do, right? Hands, legs, eyes, mouth, and then I added these because I wanted to make it very clear you're not gonna solve a problem with brute force.
Yeah.
By adding a stat that's always zero, it means okay, there's a thing that people could do to solve a problem, but you can't, right?
Yeah.
It's not okay. Yeah, you want to break open the door. Well, sure, roll hands because that's the stat we do for doing things with your hands. But it's not. It would be frame, but frame is zero, right? So
Yeah.
it becomes part of the paradigm of okay, which stat do I use for which thing? And then you look at your sheet and you say it's zero. So okay, I guess that's not a thing I can do. So that helps because it frames all actions. I mean, in role playing games, all actions are framed in the context of the things you do to make them happen, right? The sort of stat roll or skill roll or whatever we're going to call it, because that's the things that are possible. And by adding these, the things that were possible, some of them would fall into these slots, right? Because these were now available. So that sort of was one of these sort of early, oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I hadn't seen it either, but I really, really liked it.
Yeah, it kind of tells you like it's not that kind of game. This isn't the kind of game where you're going to be breaking open the door. Find something else.
Yeah.
The playbooks I love the overview of the playbooks in the rule book. I think that gives a really good taste. So then you can, dive in deeper for the ones that, reach out to you. There were 4 of us, and we were the rowdy. That was me. Was Tori the rambler?
Tori
was a talkative one. I think.
Yes,
Rambler, high speaker is probably them.
Yeah, I think Tori was the rambler, and then we also had the square and the nibbler, which worked so well with like our previous characters. We kind of just fell into them. Were any of these playbooks, not just the 4 that we played, but any of them easier or harder to refine? And like, how did you pick out the tropes that you used?
So what I generally like to do when I do design work is to find some sort of structure that helps me sort and inspire things. So all of the 8 playbooks in the starting game, I think it's 8, right? I'm not saying something wrong.
Yeah.
It should be 8. Are inspired by classes from Dungeons and Dragons.
Right.
Because that made it easy for me to, because it's also a game that plays with like fantasy tropes to a large extent, right? Just looks at them from a different lens. So I wanted to do that to the characters as well and go like, okay, what kind of niches and vibes are there? How can I move them? Some survive the transition better than others. And I think out of all of them, the square was the hardest because they're breaking the rules the most, right?
Yes.
That's the core mechanic of the game, which originally was called the brain cell because part of the shitpost meme is we all share one brain cell. I shifted it to focus because brain cell could be a little ableistic. I got the feedback, so I was like, okay, we'll take a more neutral term. And so the focus is a core mechanic, right? It's the thing you get when you make the table laugh, and it powers a lot of your big abilities. And the square just does not interact with that at all. They don't need the focus. They're already focused. They're just going to be frustrated instead, right? Which I think calls to a specific kind of player who's willing to play the straight man and will not your ideas will be always the weird ideas, right? Even though there's vain ones and sensible ones.
Yeah.
I think the square was the hardest to get to feel because I wanted it to feel right, and I'm still not sure if I got there. I think I've watched people play, and I think they're getting what I wanted it to be. But it was the weirdest one to make. It's the most goblin.
Yeah.
We our friend Anish played that playbook, and he consistently would go up to, because I think it says you get the frustration when someone laughs at your worldview or doesn't take you seriously, he would deliberately go up to the other party members and try to give them ideas that he knew that they really would not be accepting or receptive to, and then they would like just shoot him down. And I don't think we even realized, and he would just go, okay, I'll take the frustration now. Because it was also, again, all these playbooks slotted pretty perfectly into our party, which was a group of, they were family. Like it was a family of goblins, siblings. There were 3 who were born in like a goblin litter in our original lore, and then like 1 that was adopted. And so they kind of already had an existing, like, you know, playful, loving, but antagonistic relationship. So he was always playing the like straight man type character where it's like, hey guys, can we be a little nice, or can we maybe not do this weird thing? And everyone's like, no.
Nice. That's nice.
Yeah, I think it's a pretty great class to include in there.
And so funny the way, like, how all of the goblins start with unlikely knowledge and harebrained schemes, and seeing that, you know, translated to the reasonable plans.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's also what makes them hard, right? Because all playbooks have the same basic moves that are just there to make weird plans possible and help move the story forward. If you don't know what to do, one of them will get you to a way to find the solution. And they need different ones, right? They don't have the focus. So that the square had to sort of find a new angle there, yeah.
Yeah, it really rounds it out in a fun way. Well, I know you kind of touched on this when you said that you kind of got feedback. We like to ask what the sort of playtest process is like. Like, how did you playtest this in the process of developing it?
It was 2021, late 2021. I just played with people online from my regular group. I played a bunch of games. I did play, I think, with other people as well. I honestly don't remember. It came together pretty well, and the thing is that the rules aren't so complicated, right? You don't need to do a lot of playtesting to make sure these rules work, because there's no 15,000 different, you know, combat modules and special effects and spells to balance, right? It's a very forgiving game in that regard. And there's no like long, you know, leveling up mechanic. So you have to play like for like a long campaign to figure out that the fighter is worse on level 10 than the wizard is on level 10. So in that regard, it was pretty forgiving. I don't think I had, let's say maybe it was 3 or 4 playtests before I was sort of really happy with where it was at. And it was a fun process. I think the game, as said, was very close to what it would be in the end. There was some stuff like the change in brain cell, the change with the stumble that I just made after. I was always the tall person, because that's how it is if you make a game. Then I felt like, okay, always coming up with all the complications is too much work. So I, you know, tweaked the stumble rule. Right, that's the hard thing happened. It was just, I play a game, I take some notes, I talk to the people afterwards, and then I go over text again, right? That's basically what it is. And it was a few iterations of that, but not actually that many.
Have you had a chance to play it in person? One of the, like, we had a ton of fun, and the focus as a mechanic is so fun. But one of the things that we kind of ran into, I think me especially, because we used to play in person, and then obviously now when lockdown happened, we weren't playing in person, and now we live across the country, so we don't play in person anymore. And I did get very nostalgic for the idea of like grabbing the spoon and like fighting over the spoon. So I wasn't sure if you've been able to have that specific experience yet.
I did manage to play, I think 2 or 3 times in person. Not during the playtest process, but afterwards. It works as well as I imagined it to, because that's the thing I couldn't test. And I was always aware that I think most of the game translates really well to an online experience, but that is different. And I think there's actually a line in the rule where if you have the focus and you have to give it to somebody else, you can still spend it if you're really quick and do it while giving the focus to somebody else, right? That's the part that works and that's fun. That does not translate that well to online, right? Because there's no object to move over the table, right? There's no physicality to it. But that, yeah, it is fun.
We tried to translate that online. I don't know how well we ended up keeping to it, but we did a like focus is getting past 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Like you have a set amount of
countdown.
time.
Yeah, you could also maybe go like, no, I'm passing the focus to you. Right? Tap the camera or something.
Yeah.
Do a like physical transfer of power.
I also feel like y'all used the focus enough that we didn't have a lot of instances where somebody had it and another person was taking it, because You guys were pretty,
It was bouncing around.
yeah, or you were
It's
just
what it
kind of
has
like,
to.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, we were not precious with the focus. We were spending it.
Yeah, I made the experience that some players are like want to hoard it, but they really quickly stop because they can see how quickly it just comes back or jumps around. That
Right.
if you have it and you, as soon as there's a chance to spend it, you want to spend it.
I overextended myself multiple times.
You're
And
the only one who
as
did
the, yeah, I think I was. And as the rowdy, it was often to grab something. And
Mhm.
I cannot overstate enough like how fun the fact that I did not know if I was successful. Like that was for the sack race. The sack itself, we didn't know if it was gonna like rip apart at the seams or if it would turn out to be something else. And then we had like a heart to heart with one guy who was sad because his dad never played catch with him. And then I pulled out what I was hoping was a football and threw it at him. And then we were like, we're going to come back. And it's going to be like, that is such a nice touch to the game. I don't think I failed on either of them.
No, I unfortunately rolled a 6 both times, but I was really hoping that I could pull a prank like that, but it didn't end up happening.
Yeah, overextending was another one of these rules that were added during playtesting, because I found that people sometimes ended up being frustrated because they cannot come up with a joke, but they want to do a cool thing now. And to solve that tension, I added the overextending mechanic, which is, I think some people don't even know that it's there, right? It's one of the things as a tall person you really need to tell people, because it's not really all of the stuff. Most of the stuff is present on your sheet, right? All your moves, all your stuff, and that's not really visible as a thing you can do, right? It's so the thing you do to a thing to do a thing. But so it was necessary to have some sort of mechanic that allows you to do that. And then I was looking for the way to make this the most fun, and giving it to the GM as a secret role, to have like the worst timing for whatever reveal you need. Just works.
It's just so fun.
Yeah.
It gives so many fun ideas.
It allows you as the GM, because usually as the tall person in the game, your job is to be the guy that gets pranked, right? You're the target of the joke. You're setting up all the punchlines for your players.
Yeah.
And in the overextending, you can prank back.
Yes. Yeah.
That's nice.
You know what? We have to play this game again so I get the chance to actually do that. I
Yeah.
need y'all to overextend yourselves more and fail at it.
I did want to mention, because you shared in the game, and then you've talked some now about the pieces of media that inspired it, with the rule, like, or I guess just the precedent that the goblins cannot die, and the tone of the game. It reminded me a little bit of, do you know there's a Japanese reality TV show called Old Enough that it follows children?
Oh yeah. Where the
It kind of
little kids go on errands. Yeah. I've heard of
Yeah.
it. I've actually never seen it. Yeah.
I haven't actually, I've only seen clips online, but it reminded me of that, of like when we talk about stakes and building stakes, that like it might not seem like high stakes to a tall person or to, outside viewers, but to the players and to the goblins living in the world, like this is it. And
Yeah.
I like that. Have you run into any issues with like reaching those stakes or like impressing the importance of the simple,
the
everyday?
game that inspired it is Under Hill by Water, where the stakes are very low, right? It's about winning the Harvest Festival or bringing back the goat. It's not about saving the world or, resurrecting your dead grandma, whatever the plot is, right? So the stakes don't need to be that high. There is the traditional way that the book tells you to do it, which is to have the leader of your ken, which is your community of goblins, go to your goblins and go like, hey, we have a problem. You got to help with the solution because you're members of the community, right? And that usually sets up the stakes well enough. I've actually never had problems with people going like, we don't care, because you want to help, right? We need music instruments made out of vegetables for the annual celebration of the Ken or whatever, right? That makes sense. I think if you want to raise the stakes, which I think is mentioned in the book as well, the worst thing that can happen is the dissolution of the community, right? Because we're not worrying about the goblins dying, because it'll make things tense and serious, and it's not going to be a game about this. The game knows what its tone wants to be. But if you want to add really high stakes, if you fail, the community has to disband and people have to move to other Kens or find new places, which means the unit as it exists will be disrupted, which is a sad moment, right? This is not a positive thing. I guess we cannot live together anymore. But it's also not the end of the world, right? Everybody moves. Sometimes it happens. That's okay. But that's like the biggest stake that already feels, I think, too high for the game. Right?
Yeah.
It cannot be that every time you play goblins that go on an errand for the community, the life of the community is at stake.
Right.
Right? It's just if you really need to dial it up to 11, that's a button you can press, but I don't think you need to. I've never had problems with people not being invested enough in the
Yeah.
fate of these little guys.
Especially when I feel you generate it, you're like collectively when you use the like Ken generation tools. I think that everybody gets more invested in the world that you all have created together.
Yeah, I think that's a big part. Yeah.
I love all the collective, collaborative world building parts too. That's some of my favorite things in games, especially like this.
Yeah, it is the part I love the most about role playing games. It's
Yes.
the fact that I can sit down and write a story and you can too, but if we sit down and do this thing together, it'll be better. It'll be fun because you'll have an idea and I'll take it and go somewhere else with it, and then you come back with something new, right? I'm setting up a challenge as the tall person. You're bringing in a new complication that just shifts everything, 2 degrees to the left, and then I add something, and then somebody else adds something, and this sort of collaborative, chaotic, communal creativity it's the best feeling in the fucking world.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's why on our podcast we sort of organize it in read, play, game. My favorite episodes are always the read ones because I love just creating everything together.
Yeah, I love Session Zero as a concept.
Yes, absolutely. Especially as a GM, because then I love to see what the players care about. It really helps inspire everything going forward. And I love what you said. This was a no prep game, right?
Yeah, I tried. I mean, you can prep it, but I tried to make it as no prep as I could.
Yeah, and it's very effective. I think all the tools are definitely there. One question that we threw in here was we noticed that New York was an option for one of the tables. Have you ever played a game set in New York?
I think a surprising amount of games have played in New York because, in my experience, as soon as that's one of the options, because it's the odd one out, right? It's the weird one, and that also was added as like a lark late on. I was like, yeah, sure, why not? But it opens up, suddenly like a lot of new things are possible, right?
Yeah.
It's not just all fantasy. It could also just be in our town. And like the traditional approach is every player rolls a d20, and then you pick from among all the rolled options which place you play in, right? There's not a list of 20 and you have to take a long time to pick. You roll and then it's less and then you pick. But I find that if New York is rolled, people want to go there.
Absolutely.
I think I've had 2 or 3 games in New York.
I would love to play one for sure. We already had our sort of established settings, so we kind of like added details, but that was one that definitely caught our eye.
Yeah. Pigeons always play a big role in New York for some reason.
I'm sure. That and rats, maybe.
Yeah.
Sewers, I guess. We also have some questions about sort of the design, the visual design. Emma, did you want to ask that?
Oh, sure. The playbook itself, or the rule book, and in it, the playbooks look incredible. We talked about this a little bit before. Like when we saw it in our local game store, it just immediately drew our eye. How important is it for you as a game designer to spend time on the layout? Like, what do you dedicate to that versus the initial ideas and mechanics of the game?
I mean, it is the sort of latter part of it. So it doesn't drive the game's development, but it is really important. I think there's a benefit to me doing it all, right? In like big studios, somebody writes the text or many people write the text and then somebody does the layout or maybe multiple people do the layout. And for me, because it's one process, I'm doing the layout, which also means I change the text to look better in the layout, right? Sometimes, I'm going to scratch the sentence or I'm going to rewrite this or, I don't like how it breaks here, so I'm going to rephrase this, which is a possibility I have because I'm doing it all. And it's pretty important to me that it looks pleasing, that it looks, fun. And in some parts, a rule book for role-playing games is this really weird thing. It's something you may read for like entertainment, right? Oh, there's like fun stories in here and like interesting world building, but it's also a manual, right? Like for your, I was gonna say DVD player, but nobody has those anymore, right? So, but it's a manual, so it has functional demands. People need to be able to read it and understand the rules. They also need to be able to find the rules they need when they need them. If you take the rule book and open it in the middle, which it's bound to open at because
Yeah.
it's a saddle stitch zine, you open on the characters.
That is incredible. I didn't even like
Because that's the thing you probably need if you need to show somebody rule book. Like,
Wow.
here's the
that. That
characters,
is so
pick one,
convenient.
right? That is part of its function, right? Which is also part of its game, because even though you're playing the game in your heads and with your dice and at your table and blah, 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 this thing is the one game aid you have, so it needs to be functional, right? So that is really important to me, that it looks good. Again, I mentioned it earlier, the cover does so much for the game. I love it. I love that it's a wonderful wraparound cover. You can see like the
Yes.
little goblins peeking out in the back. I'm so happy with the
That's
work
so
I got at
cute.
it. It's such a nice piece. But right, the game, you see it, you want to have a look at it. It needs to be good. It needs to be interesting. The artwork needs to, give you ideas and inspire you and be fun, and it has to work, right? It has to fulfill its job as a manual. So it is pretty important to me that it manages to tick all the boxes.
Yeah, it is. It is very, very easy to navigate, which I like, and that's also like. I mean, we have the PDF too, but I also really like having it physically. For which I didn't even notice, but that was extremely convenient to me when I kept opening it up to the important pages. It was really really nice to have in my hand.
Yeah, when I was doing the layout, I was making a prototype, right? I was printing the pages, I was stapling them myself, and I was like, oh wait, if I switch a few things around, the characters will be in the middle. That'll be great. Right? That was not a thing I planned on, like, oh, I'm gonna do it this way. Just a thing I noticed of like, oh, I'm almost there already. I'll just shift a thing.
That's something I didn't even think about that I think would be great for like any game. I think that anyone should keep that in mind when designing games.
Yeah, but this is then a question of binding, right? Not all books open in the middle, right? Because it's a saddle scene, it has a very clear middle thing that feels very different than everything else.
Yeah.
While like bigger books have like, more of these little bits everywhere.
Right.
But yeah, how form informs function is really interesting with that.
And the only way to get there is by actually prototyping.
Yeah.
One of the things I picked up in university. If you want to see how it works, you got to build it first.
Makes a lot of sense.
And you work in video game design. Does that inform that concept of form and function? How impactful is that in your RPG design?
I think at the end of the day, the big difference is that in a video game, you have to understand the rules, in the sense that you need to be able to interact with them, right? You need to know that if you press this button, this will happen. But you cannot do it wrong.
Yeah.
You cannot press the button and something else happens, right? So it's a lot easier. And it's the big challenge in role-playing games is writing rules in a way that they're unambiguous and easy to understand, right? Because unambiguous language sometimes becomes too verbose, too like lawyery, which is also nobody can fucking parse that. So I think, I don't know. I think I lost track of the question. I'm sorry.
I love mechanics, and I love how mechanics affect theme, and I feel like your experience as, working in video games definitely would be in conversation with that. So something interesting there.
Yeah. I mean, I think my focus on like usability, and we talked about it in the book itself, right? It is a large part of that, because I think because in video games you have to understand how things work, and if you're making more complex games with like unusual interactions, interface design becomes really, really important, right? I gotta understand what's happening here, and the way I can do that is by the interface showing me what it's doing. And the book is the interface I have when I make a role-playing game, right? The book and the character sheets and that kind of thing. So I think that's part of why I was thinking to myself, like, oh, if it opens in the middle, what do you need?
Yeah, and the role that I sort of fill on the podcast is that of the pro bono rules lawyer, where like sometimes I won't play the games, but like I'll kind of sit on the side and like look at the rules to make sure that we're at least talking about them, understanding that it can be flexible.
Yeah.
But I do appreciate when it's pretty logically arranged and easy to find, because sometimes when you're having to like, it can take a lot of time to to sort through stuff.
I mean, it's thankful because it's like 56 pages, I think.
Yeah. It's very simple, especially, since I was the GM, the TP, I was, the last section of the game is really only relevant to me anyway, the like generation part. So it's like, I don't need to, I have that in my head. It's more, I need to make sure that I can give people the rules that show up. Not that the rules are, like you said, the most complicated in the entire world, but good to have them in mind.
Now I do have a question for you. So, running the game and reading the book, how well do you think the sort of GM section, which is, given the size of the book, pretty expansive?
Yeah.
Right? I think it takes up 8 pages or 6 pages, right? It's a tenth of the book or more. And how well do you think it prepared you for the game?
I thought it was honest, and when I said this was one of my favorite games that we've played, it was definitely from the TP, like the GM perspective, because it was so incredibly helpful. I liked the breakdown into the 4 components of it, the need, errand, place, and character, and then I thought the side quest was something I really, really enjoyed too, because that's always something I've struggled with like adding even just one side quest thing fleshes out the world so much more, because it feels less like a railroad and more like here's another thing that you can take or leave, and then it of course adds in an extra complication later on. Like, for example, they had a time pressure to get back to their ken from the place that they were, but like they knew that they needed to get these seeds for the goblin that they were the other goblin that was actually a goblin that one of the main characters had a crush on. So like the stakes there were even higher. So it was like, we're doing the thing, but we have to get the seeds, before we go. Yeah. And I thought it was really, really helpfully arranged and like kind of a logical setup. So I think this is great, not only for this game, but it's an excellent resource for any game.
I'm happy to hear that. I did my best to give as much advice as you need to be able to kick off a session and run one errand within 3 hours.
Yeah.
Right, that's my goal, right? And I think that's a pretty good, and I think the game hits it well often enough, or it did for me, that you can sit down with people who've never played the game, tell them the rules, have them make characters, and get them through a story that has an end in like 3 to 4 hours.
And I love that, especially if you're playing with a group that's not done it before, and then like perhaps maybe you could end up, after you play through this, or like a little campaign of this, or even just one game of this, you can even move on to other games too. And then that's sort of, people are now sort of really getting into it if they're not familiar with the way it goes. And then that's great for a GM too, because especially with games like this, I've noticed games like D&D and other big games, D&D is obviously the biggest one, but like there's so many resources across every, there's actual plays everywhere of all of these games, and you don't always get an actual play.
I don't think they're resources. I think they're good entertainment and usually terrible resources, because then people think, oh God, I gotta be a voice actor.
Yes, that's true. In that respect,
right? I gotta be a professional comedian.
Yeah. I think what they do at least get in people's heads, though, are like a lot of the rules, especially like, when you've watched it enough times, you just kind of start to understand how like at least some of the rules work. Not that they always do the rules correctly or in a way that's realistic for a table game, but you're not going to... That is what also we like to do with the podcast, is like have it just be as real a portrayal of a game as you can, and just kind of get things across to people however we can. Which I also really liked about the challenges, because it's like breaking it down into the number of challenges. It's like, we're like take it, simplify it, and it's streamlined. You don't need to get bogged down in the world.
Yeah, that was a thing I put in because I wanted to keep the time for an errand short, right? And putting a specific number of challenges in there just keeps it short. I had a version where I think it's always 3, right? It tells you to add 3 challenges. I had a version where it's like add as many challenges as you have players. But the problem is the more players you have, the more time people need for the challenges, because everybody wants to do a thing and you get complications and people have more weird cookie ideas that get you off base. So 3 is a really good number. It's I don't know. I'm very happy with the way it turned out, and I think I'm happy to hear that the GMing tall person, how to run an errand section worked well.
And we're getting close on time, but I do really want to fit in really quickly an additional tiny little thing about that, because what I thought was really nice about having those 3 is that if you keep to that structure, you don't need to necessarily do exactly what you planned at the beginning. Like I had one challenge to be finding this person, right? And in my head, they were going to go watch a performance and like figure out which of the people was. And then they ended up in a different location. And I'm like, oh crap, how am I going to get them back onto that challenge? It's like, well, maybe the reward for winning the sack race is getting to meet this person. You know, it allows you to find more avenues to keep it streamlined. But
yes, we are right at the end. So before we wrap up, we have Underhill by Water written down, but do you have any game recommendations for us to play just out in the world? And then please plug any cool projects that you have coming up that you want people to check out.
Okay, so games that are worth playing, there's too many of them. The first that comes to mind is Wild Sea, which is sort of more of a big classic RPG. I managed to do some guest writing for it, which I was very happy with. That's the last thing I GM'd. That's the first thing in my mind. I do love everything Apocalypse World. Everything sort of powered by the Apocalypse is really good. Blades in the Dark is really good, but that's everybody's heard of that, and I think it has a bunch of issues about that I don't like. Ooh, For the Queen. There you go. For the Queen is really good.
we've heard that one.
Yeah.
It's a card game that's also a storytelling game that is so minimal and so simple, but so wonderfully elegant that you start with nothing except a basic premise and a visual card. And at the end of it, you have a web of characters that love and hate each other. It's wonderful. You can play it with 2 or more players. It's barely an RPG, right? It's a card game that's a narrative storytelling game, but it's really, really good. I really recommend
like
it.
this on the podcast for sure.
It's great for people that have never heard of role playing games and are scared of D&D, but would be interested in playing a fantasy story. It's really, really good. They had a second edition release just recently that has improved art and stuff. It looks really nice. Yeah, and in terms of cool projects I have coming up, I did the Mending Circle Kickstarter a year ago, which is a game about witches trying to heal the world, one person at a time. That's the Kickstarter's done, but there's a bunch of books out in the wild you can get, and there's more somewhere in the basement of mine. And I am working on a new big video game, but there's not too much to say about it right now because it's still in the middle of prototyping.
Yeah.
And I've got another role-playing game on somewhere in the pipeline, but it's on hold because I got other things to do. And I'm thinking about another Kickstarter for an old project, so nothing real I can sort of shill to you. I'm just here for fun.
Keep tabs on the Shark Bomb website.
Yeah,
for sure. Be sure to follow,
like and subscribe.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. Follow all the social media wherever you're most present here these days in the social media apocalyptic landscape.
Everything fragments and gets worse. And shitification.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. It's been really, really lovely talking to you, and it was fantastic game. So fun to play. We will give you a heads up when we release those episodes because it was delightful to play.
Yeah, might not be for a little bit.
I'm very happy to hear it. Oh, I can point out one thing. I did this year in May for my birthday. I hosted a Goblin Errands game jam where a very small handful of people made content for Goblin Errands, which is available on itch.io. There's like a new playbook that I made called the Minion, which is inspired by the Warlock. That might be fun to check out for people who like Goblin Errands. There's some more stuff you can find. It's free.
Yay.
I didn't even know about that. I'm going to check that out. Awesome. Well, thank you so much. That's the end of our interview. And for the listeners, we will see you at a different table. Thank you so much. Bye.